The streets of Kabul shimmer in the afternoon haze. Dust swirls between the stalls, where children sell small trinkets for a few coins. From the distance, the call to prayer rises above the rooftops, echoing across a city scarred by decades of war. At first glance, it feels like a portrait of daily life in Afghanistan, fragile, humble, enduring. But beneath this familiar rhythm lies a truth that few dare to face. In the heart of this land, where faith and survival intertwine, there exists a ritual so haunting, so methodically cruel, that it defies the limits of human conscience. It is called Time's Bacha Bazi * boy play, a practice where young boys, often no older than 9 or 10, are taken from their families, dressed in ornate garments, and forced to dance for the pleasure of men who command power, guns, and influence. To the outside world, it may appear as a relic of a forgotten time, something buried deep within the past, yet Time's Bacha Bazi times is not history. It is a living wound, a mirror reflecting what happens when power, religion, and poverty merge into a single, unstoppable system of control. This story is not told to shock. It is told to understand, to uncover how an empire of silence has protected one of the darkest trades of the modern era, and why, after centuries of condemnation, it continues to survive. Tonight, we walk into the shadowed halls of history to ask a question that humanity has long avoided. How did a society once defined by faith and honor come to normalize the destruction of its own children? Long before the borders of modern Afghanistan were drawn, the seeds of Time's Bacha Bazi times had already been planted. Its earliest traces can be found in the royal courts of ancient Persia and the Timurid Empire eras when beauty, art, and power coexisted with cruelty. In those courts, young boys were dressed in silks, trained to dance, and presented as symbols of refinement to amuse rulers and generals. What began as a ritual of performance slowly evolved into a ritual of possession. Centuries of war and tribal hierarchy hardened this pattern. Afghanistan became a crossroads of conquerors, Persians, Mongols, and later, empires that fought to control the Silk Road. In such an environment, authority was measured not by law, but by dominance. Women were hidden behind veils and walls, and in their absence, men turned to boys for companionship and display. The practice was woven into the fabric of military life, spreading among warlords, tribal leaders, and soldiers who equated control with masculinity. By the 19th century, British and Russian travelers passing through Central Asia recorded their observations in disbelief. They described grand feasts where commanders boasted of their time's Bacha *, the boys who danced in jeweled dresses under the torchlight. The guests would laugh, drink, and bid for private access, as if humanity itself were a game of ownership. What makes Time's Bacha Bazi times so distinct from similar practices in ancient civilizations is its persistence. While the world moved forward, Afghanistan's cycles of war and poverty kept it anchored to a feudal past. Each new empire, from the Persians to the Soviets, left behind ruins but never stability. And within the ruins, the same social hierarchy survived. Men with weapons at the top, women and children beneath their mercy. This endurance is not merely cultural, it is structural. A society repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt around conflict preserves only what guarantees survival, obedience, hierarchy, and silence. And in that silence, Bacha Bazi times endured as both entertainment and currency. A cruel inheritance passed from one generation of conquerors to the next. The question then is not how Time's Bacha Bazi times began, but why it never ended. To understand how Time's Bacha Bazi times survived the passage of time, one must look not at the poor, but at the powerful. The endurance of this practice has little to do with ignorance and everything to do with complicity. In Afghanistan, power flows through a network of tribal leaders, military commanders, and religious authorities. Over generations, these figures have shaped both moral law and daily life. Yet behind the sermons of purity and faith, many have quietly preserved a culture of indulgence. They cloak their actions in sacred language, arguing that it is not a sin because it involves no love or because it does not violate the rules concerning women. It is an illusion of innocence built upon theological manipulation. There exists an old Afghan saying, women are for family, boys are for pleasure. It is more than a phrase, it is a code of justification, a verbal key that unlocks the door to hypocrisy. Under this code, The exploitation of boys becomes not a violation, but a symbol of privilege. The more boys a man controls, the greater his social prestige. This corruption of faith and authority has created an invisible economy, a trade in which children become commodities. The structure is chillingly efficient. Recruiters scout orphanages, refugee camps, and the slums of Kabul and Kunduz. Promises are made to desperate families: food, shelter, and education. In truth, it is a purchase disguised as charity. Once taken, the boys vanish into a hidden world where they are trained, dressed, and prepared to perform at gatherings attended by police, judges, and clerics. At these events, the facade of respectability is complete. The men sit in circles, their turbans perfectly folded, their beards well-groomed. They laugh, sip tea, and watch as a child dances, his costume glittering, his eyes fixed on the floor. When the music ends, some of the guests compete for his company. The child becomes both entertainment and reward. Few dare to interfere. The police, often participants themselves, look away. The courts dismiss accusations, and those who attempt to expose the system are silenced, sometimes permanently. In such an environment, the line between criminal and enforcer dissolves. Power protects itself. Unlike many hidden crimes, Bacha Bazi Times is not driven by secrecy, but by normalization. It thrives because it has been rationalized into tradition, cleansed by ritual, and reinforced by fear. When faith is distorted and law is for sale, even innocence becomes a currency. Every shift in Afghanistan's political landscape has carried Bacha Bazi Times along with it, reshaping but never erasing it. Like a parasite, it adapts to survive under new rulers, new ideologies, and new wars. During the 1,990 seconds when the Taliban first rose to power, they declared the practice forbidden under Islamic law. Publicly, they portrayed Bacha Bazi Times as a sin, a symbol of the corruption they had vowed to cleanse. Their punishments were severe. Some offenders were executed, others imprisoned. For a time, the dancing stopped. The boys disappeared from the public eye. Yet, beneath the surface, the demand never vanished. It simply went quiet, waiting for power to change hands again. When the Taliban were overthrown in 2001, foreign troops flooded the country, and a new government took shape. But the power vacuum that followed opened the door for old warlords to return, men who had fought during the Soviet era and now held military or political authority. Many of them had once been patrons in the Bacha Bazi Times circles of their youth. With newfound influence, they revived the trade in plain sight, hosting private gatherings under the protection of their offices. International aid flowed into Afghanistan, yet corruption devoured it. Police, judges, and soldiers took bribes to look away. The boys danced again, this time beneath the fluorescent lights of newly built compounds. Then, in 2021, the Taliban returned. Once more, they announced a ban, promising to root out the practice and punish offenders. But Afghanistan had changed, and so had the Taliban. Behind the rhetoric of moral purity, reports began to surface of commanders quietly maintaining Bacha Times, boys in private compounds. In some provinces, the same officials who enforced the ban were found to be its most frequent violators. Music and dance were outlawed, forcing the practice deeper underground. What had once been semi-public entertainment became a hidden ritual in remote villages and guarded estates. The secrecy made it even harder for outsiders to intervene. Aid organizations hesitated to act, fearful of being accused of cultural intrusion. Journalists who investigated found their access restricted or their safety threatened. At the same time, the country's economy collapsed. Foreign aid vanished, jobs disappeared, and families found themselves starving once more. Mothers faced a choice no human being should ever watch their children die of hunger or hand them over to men who promised food and shelter. Out of desperation, many surrendered. The circle had closed again. The wars had changed, the flags had changed, but the suffering remained the same. In Afghanistan's long struggle between morality and survival, Bacha Bazi Times had become both symptom and disease-proof that when poverty and power intertwine, darkness does not die. It simply hides until it is summoned again. To understand the true horror of Bacha Bazi *, one must look beyond the physical abuse and into the invisible scars it leaves behind. This system does not merely exploit children, it rewrites their sense of reality. For the boys drawn into this world, indoctrination begins almost immediately. They are told they are fortunate, chosen, even loved. Their new masters assure them that obedience is virtue, that gratitude is survival. Day by day, they are stripped of their old identity, their names, their voices, even their posture. They are taught to move with grace, to speak softly, to smile on command. Every gesture becomes a lesson in submission. Psychologists describe this process as times learned helplessness, times the moment when a person stops believing that resistance can change anything. These boys live under constant threat. Disobedience brings beating, starvation, or punishment of their families. The fear becomes so deep that even freedom feels dangerous. Over time, their survival instincts twist into loyalty toward those who enslave them. Some begin to defend their captors, insisting they owe them gratitude for food and shelter. It is the cruelest illusion to love the hand that harms you. When these children grow older, the damage does not fade. Many are left with profound psychological fractures, anxiety, depression, and a sense of worthlessness that shadows them into adulthood. Their understanding of intimacy is warped. They equate affection with control, attention with pain. Trust becomes almost impossible. Some survivors retreat from the world entirely, consumed by shame and silence. Others repeat the pattern, becoming exploiters themselves, reenacting the only form of power they have ever known. In this way, Bacha Bazi Times sustains itself not only through force, but through memory. It breeds generations of broken men, some who suffer, others who inflict suffering, and many who no longer know the difference. The tragedy extends beyond the victims. Communities begin to rot from within, losing the ability to distinguish moral outrage from acceptance. When exploitation becomes normalized, conscience decays. The line between sin and custom blurs until the crime itself becomes invisible. This is how Bacha Bazi Times endures, not through armies or ideology, but through silence, fear, and the slow erosion of empathy. When a society accepts the suffering of its children as inevitable, something greater than innocence is lost, its soul begins to decay. The story of Bacha Bazi Times is not only a tragedy of individuals, it is a mirror reflecting the moral collapse of an entire nation. In Afghanistan, the boys who survived this system rarely find redemption. Once discarded, they carry the mark of shame that was never theirs to bear. Communities view them as tainted, unworthy of marriage, unfit for work, unclean before God. Their past becomes a life sentence. And so, the cycle continues. Isolation breeds despair, despair breeds silence, and silence allows the next generation of exploitation to begin. This silence extends beyond Afghanistan's borders. The world has long known of Bacha Bazi asterisk. Reports have been written, documentaries produced, officials condemned. Yet, international action remains timid. Humanitarian organizations, fearful of being accused of disrespecting cultural traditions, tread carefully. Governments that once promised reform now prefer to look away, focusing on larger political agendas. In this quiet neglect, the practice survives, reshaped, relocated, but never destroyed. Religion, which should serve as a shield for the innocent, has often been used as a veil for the guilty. The same verses that speak of mercy and justice are twisted into tools of justification. Those who could have stood as voices of conscience instead choose convenience. Temples and mosques echo with prayer, yet the cries of the powerless remain unheard. But Bacha Bazi Times is not simply Afghanistan's shame. It is humanity's reflection in its darkest glass. It asks every nation, every culture, the same question. When we witness cruelty and remain silent, are we not complicit in it? True change will not come through laws or punishments alone. It must begin with acknowledgement, with the courage to see what has been hidden, to name what has been denied. The boys of Bacha Bazi Times are not ghosts of a distant past. They are the children of now trapped between faith and fear, waiting for a world that will finally choose to see them. The story closes where it began, in the narrow streets of Kabul. The call to prayer still rises, the markets still hum, and somewhere behind a closed door, a drum begins to beat. A boy adjusts his bright costume and prepares to dance for men who mistake domination for power. His movements are graceful, but each step is a cry that history has not yet answered. Until the world can look upon that dance and feel outrage instead of indifference, Bacha Bazi Times will live on, not because of evil alone, but because of the silence that protects it. As night descends over the Afghan plains, The sounds of the city fade the barking of dogs, the distant hum of generators, the last call to prayer echoing through the dust. Yet somewhere, in a hidden room, the faint rhythm of a drum continues. A boy dances under a flickering light, his body moving with precision, his eyes empty. The room watches in silence, as if humanity itself has turned away. What began centuries ago as a ritual of power has become a wound that refuses to heal. Bacha Bazi times is not sustained by faith, nor by culture, but by the absence of accountability. It thrives in the spaces where compassion has been replaced by fear, where hunger becomes a bargain, and where justice is traded for silence. History records wars, revolutions, and dynasties, yet it rarely records the quiet suffering of those who had no voice. The boys of Bacha Bazi times belong to that unspoken history. Their names are forgotten, their stories erased, their humanity reduced to shadows behind closed doors. But history, if it teaches anything, reminds us that silence is never neutral. It is a choice. A civilization is measured not by its wealth or monuments, but by how it protects those who cannot protect themselves. And when that protection fails, no empire, no faith, no tradition can escape the stain. Someday, perhaps, a generation will rise that refuses to accept what their fathers ignored. A generation that sees not entertainment, not custom, but children who deserve laughter instead of fear. Until that day, the dance continues unseen by most, unbearable to all who truly look. Because in the end, Bacha Bazi times is not only a story about Afghanistan. It is a warning to the world that when power goes unchecked and compassion falls silent, innocence will always be the first to die. And somewhere, beneath the dust and prayers of Kabul, the echoes of those lost children still wait to be heard.